Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week we bring you leading nuclear deterrence experts for a lively discussion on current topics. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Deterrence Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
All right, and welcome into our next edition of the NucleCast, where the Advanced Nuclear Weapons Alliance Deterrence Center brings some of the greatest thinkers and operators together to talk about nuclear weapons and to talk about nuclear modernization. Now today, we are very, very blessed to hear from one of the truly esteemed thinkers about nuclear weapons. Dr. Mark Schneider is a Senior Analyst with the National Institute for Public Policy. Now, if you were to read Mark's bio, it is a mile long because Mark has been around the block and has done some amazing things. And in fact, didn't you have a recent article that came out of last week talking about the future of deterrence?
Yes, on China.
So Mark, of course, is an expert in Russia and, of course, China as well. But today, we're going to talk Russia and Russian nuclear weapons policy and strategy. Now, Mark, of course, also contributed to Guide to Nuclear Deterrence in the Age of Great Power Competition, in which he wrote Russian Nuclear Strategy and Forces. And so with that introduction, Mark, let me jump into the first question. So Russia, they're a nuclear peer, but has our failure to modernize allowed a Russian arsenal that once lagged the United States? And, as Matt Kronig wrote a great book on nuclear strategy in which he said, hey, in every instance in which there was crisis between two nuclear powers, the power that had the superior arsenal always achieved its objectives and came out on top. And I guess I'm wondering, do you see us at a time where that advantage that we've historically maintained over the Russians has now been matched, and have the Russians, because of their aggressive modernization, surpassed us? Or where do you see we are in terms of the U.S.-Russia dynamic?
Well, unfortunately, they've already surpassed us, although there are areas where we still maintain an advantage. During the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Soviet Union, we had over 20-1 nuclear advantage. Now the only real debate is whether they have twice as many nuclear weapons as we do, or 4 or 5 times as many. I'm on the 4 or 5. But even if it's twice as many, this is a fundamental shift in the balance of power. And there's even a greater difference in modernization. We're still about 10 years away from any modernization of any significance in the U.S. nuclear deterrent. They have been modernizing every year since 2007, and they will continue to modernize on a very large scale. The most amazing thing of what they're doing is it's almost Soviet-like, despite the enormous difference in economics that existed. The Soviets invested, 40% of their gross national product at the peak of the Cold War in military, and a significant percentage, probably 20 or 30, was in nuclear. They actually probably invest a much less of a percentage of the gross national product, but the percentage that goes to nuclear is higher probably than that of the Soviet Union. They've announced over 20 strategic nuclear weapon modernization programs, and they talk a great deal about that. The modernization is constant. It's not like what we plan, you're basically replacing very old systems, 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old systems with new systems. Their modernization is literally never ending. They say that they have already modernized 83% of their strategic nuclear forces. within the last month or so, the head of the United States Strategic Command said they've modernized 80 to 85%. So there's no debate anymore on that issue. And the real thing you have to understand is that when they reach 100%, things are not going to stop there. They're just going on to replacements of new systems with either improved versions of it or additional new systems. And that is going to go on indefinitely unless there's a complete economic collapse in the Soviet Union, because as they openly state at the most senior level, President Putin, General Shoigu, their defense minister, this is their highest national priority. And they really think nuclear weapons are important. They make nuclear use threats all the time. They exercise the first use of nuclear weapons in all of their major nuclear exercises. And by the way, one of the big ones has just concluded yesterday, SAPA 2021. And there's no indication at all that this is going to change any time soon. They have the lowest threshold for the use of nuclear weapons in the world. And now we face something Admiral Richard stated recently. We don't have one peer competitor. Right now, thanks to what the Chinese are doing, we've got two peer competitors. And when you put the two together, it's possible that by the end of this decade, that they may, in combination, outgun us by 7 or 8 times. And even if it's not that, it's likely to be certainly 5 or 6 times. So this is a fundamental negative development in global security, and in the worst case, it could result in war.
Now, Mark, as we think about the why of Russian modernization, would you say that we might be in a period of time now where Russia's reliance on nuclear weapons is similar to, the American reliance during the period of the New Look, and that, we have superior conventional forces in Europe, and therefore Russia is turning to, nuclear forces to, is that great equalizer? Or would you say there's something else motivating Russian modernization?
Well, the period of the New Look, the 1950s, was the period that we had the maximum investment in nuclear forces. We spent 10% of our gross national product on defense. That's 2.5 times what we're spending today, and a much higher percentage of the budget, probably at least 20%, went to nuclear forces. So in that, there is a significant similarity between the New Look period of the 50s and current Russian policy. But I would point out one significant difference. During the 1950s, there was a general recognition that nuclear weapons use was dangerous, that we wanted to deter, not fight. Putin talks about nuclear weapons use. He's the only president of any country, that has nuclear weapons, or any country that doesn't have nuclear weapons for that matter, that makes nuclear attack threats. He does that frequently, and there's no indication that that is going to change. He's a 19th century imperialist, and his role model is basically Bismarck. And the problem with that is Bismarck wouldn't have been Bismarck if he lived in a world with nuclear weapons, because he had enough sense to recognize that it's too dangerous to do that sort of stuff. And this is, of course, before World War I, and before we got a taste of the impact of modern industrial technology on warfare, where you can kill tens of millions of people. With nuclear weapons, you can go up an order of magnitude on that and do it very quickly. So this is a fundamental change. Yet this guy in 2015, Mr. Putin, said that he learned on the mean streets of St. Petersburg, Leningrad, the old Soviet name for St. Petersburg, that when a fight's inevitable, get in the first strike. And no action officer put that in the speech. This is pure Putin. And that's the way he thinks. And he's a dangerous man. And giving him nuclear superiority is perhaps the dumbest thing that any country's ever done, because their whole strategy is based on the premise that they can initiate a small nuclear strike and that we will capitulate and there won't be a large nuclear war. And he's just said that if he had sunk a British destroyer in the Black Sea, it wouldn't likely have led to a major war. That's a really dangerous mentality to have when you're talking about using nuclear weapons in very low level conflicts.
Now, it's about time for us to take a break. But before we go to the break, I want to pose a question that when we come back, I'd ask for you to contemplate. So, as we think about the future with Russia, do you think that the current modernization path that the United States is on in regard to maintaining stable deterrence is the right modernization path to deter Putin? And so I'll throw that over to you, and then when we come back from the break, I'll ask you to respond.
This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence.
All right, and we're back with Dr. Mark Schneider with the National Institute for Public Policy, and we are discussing Russian nuclear strategy. Now, Mark, before the break, I asked you to tell us whether you thought we were on the right modernization path to effectively deter Russia.
Well, yes and no. The yes part of it is the Triad is absolutely essential for deterrence. You cannot have an effective deterrence if you start cutting legs away. The ICBM force in particular, which is one of the main targets of the arms control enthusiasts and the left, is critically important because there's no way to take it out with a small strike of nuclear weapons. And that's the whole basis of Putin's nuclear strategy, the idea that they can launch a small number of nuclear weapons and that will result in the West capitulating to them. If they're put in a position where they can hit 5 targets or 10 targets in the United States, potentially even with low-yield weapons, maybe 15 low-yield weapons if you go that way, and they can take out a large portion of our nuclear deterrent. I think that increases the probability of them actually doing what they say they're going to do significantly. Now, so the Triad, the bombers, the ICBMs, and the ballistic missile submarines is critical. On the negative side, our modernization is minimal. We are doing, one system for every leg of the Triad. Their modernization has somewhere between 2 and maybe a half dozen systems for every leg, and they're expanding the Triad. They're introducing new systems that never existed before. Some of which I think are literally crazy, like the nuclear-powered cruise missile. They haven't had a successful test of that yet, and every time they launch the thing, it crashes, and you got radiation on Europe. The other one is, I think, a little more sensible, but still very dangerous. That's the nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed drone submarine called the Poseidon. So they have a vastly greater modernization program. They are staging nuclear tests. That's in the LSD State Department compliance reports. We're not. that puts us at a really major disadvantage. And it explains the scope of the nuclear weapons modernization, the actual weapons rather than the delivery vehicles. They have a major program. They've said this at the defense minister level, that they're actually developing, introducing new types of nuclear weapons. And this goes back to 2005 when the defense minister said that they're nearly operational. And that's been continuous. We are pursuing something called stockpile stewardship, which is basically trying to keep our old weapons working forever and rebuilding them and then rebuilding them again. That's very difficult to do from a technical standpoint without nuclear testing, because we build our nuclear weapons to be inherently what we call one-point safe, which means if you shoot a bullet into them, you drop them, you light a fire on them, and they explode, you won't get any significant nuclear yield. That's a great thing to have, and I'm not suggesting to change that in any way. But the side effect of that is they're less robust than they would be if we weren't worried about that sort of thing. So we start out with a disadvantage there, and then you have them testing and we're not testing, and it's gone on at least since the middle 1990s. There's an impressive amount of literature in Russia where senior officials actually were talking about staging what they call hydronuclear tests in the 1990s. And in one or two instances, the atomic energy minister said they're actually doing that. So there's no question about that in my mind. I think there's a real possibility that they are staging more than hydronuclear tests, that they're staging low-yield nuclear tests. And they're very, very difficult to detect. And I think that is going on, although I don't have proof of that. But certainly in relation to the very extensive modernization program that's going on their nuclear weapons themselves, you'd almost have to do something like that to do the sorts of things they're openly talking about doing. And that includes not only standard types of nuclear weapons, fission fusion weapons, but very low collateral damage, directed energy inputs, output types of weapons. Admiral Monroe, Vice Admiral Monroe, the former director of DNA, has written a great deal about this, and it's a very disturbing development, although it hardly gets a lot of attention in the United States. But it's something that we don't have and they do have. So that, I think, is a significant factor. The last thing I talk about is the hypersonic weapons. One of the most serious disparities that now exists is in hypersonic weapons. The Russians have at least a half dozen hypersonic missile systems. They're all either nuclear armed or dual capable. In other words, nuclear or conventional. We have literally zero programs to develop a hypersonic nuclear capable missile. That is a vast disparity we're allowing to develop. Putin brags about these weapons all the time, and he rattles them all the time, and he believes that it gives them a tremendous advantage, and in some key respects it does. The U.S. National Command Authority, the President, the Secretary of Defense, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, is very vulnerable to nuclear attack. And the big difference between hypersonic and ballistic missiles is they get to their targets much faster than ballistic missiles do. And Putin has actually alluded to that in one of the State of the Nation addresses. He told us to look at the timelines. Now, he didn't elaborate, but what he meant was that you can't get the president out of Washington, D.C. in time to prevent him from being killed by Russian nuclear hypersonic missiles. So that is a really bad situation to allow to happen. And my view is Ideally, we should be going ahead with a nuclear armed hypersonic program. I mean, take one of the number of hypersonic missiles we're developing and just put a small nuclear weapon on it. And it wouldn't be terribly expensive. The big cost would be already taken by the conventional version, and we'd have something to deter them with. Instead, even late in this decade, when the B-21, which should be a very advanced stealth bomber, comes into operation, until the convention of the nuclear cruise missile, the LSRO, is ready, and that's probably in the 30s, early 30s. The only thing we're going to have to carry on that thing is gravity bombs, and that's kind of silly. I mean, it's the least. I mean, you built in a vulnerability into the system for no apparent reason. You don't want gravity bombs are fine for a lot of targets. The new version B-61 will have near precision guidance, which will help significantly. But it's not something you want to drop on a heavily defended target, because you're likely either to get shot down trying to get it close enough, or even if you do survive the penetration, the bomb itself could be intercepted after you let it go, because it's not stealthy.
Oh, wow. That is a detailed and very much appreciated description of where you think we are in terms of our modernization and where we should go relative to the Russians. Now, unfortunately, we are out of time for the podcast. And so what I want to do is I want to ask Mark, at some future point, would you be willing to come back and give us more of your thoughts on
certainly.
the Russians and the Chinese? Oh, excellent. Wonderful. All right. Well, I will go ahead and end the show and say thank you, Mark, for being on the show, and thank you for the work that you do. And we will definitely look forward to having you back in the future.
Well, thank you. And I certainly appreciate you having me on to begin.